If you clicked on this video, it's probably because you're wondering, how does Genshin Impact have anything to do with Diablo 4? Well, prepare to be triggered, because according to Metacritic, GameSpot, Kotaku, IGN, and GamesRadar, they're both action RPGs. And now that my audience retention has dropped off a cliff, I want to get into the real reasons why I think there's a lot of pretty fair comparisons between the two games. But before I do that, I need to lay some background information. Yes, I play Genshin Impact. It's one of my favorite games to dissect. But this isn't my first rodeo with Diablo. I didn't have a PC until I was a teenager, so I never got the full experience of Diablo 1 and 2. But I've sunk weeks of my life into Diablo 3. I didn't start playing until after Reaper of Souls, so I missed out on the apparently terrible state the game released in. That's probably why I look at the game so favorably. I genuinely enjoy it. For me, the most satisfying gameplay loops are ones where you can give yourself a goal and figure out a way to achieve it that allows flexibility to do other things along the way without losing your progress. And let me tell you, D3, D4, and Genshin Impact all scratch that itch as long as you don't listen to the comments that say otherwise. I mean, really, it's like some of these people live on another planet. That brings me to my first comparison. In-game. Whether you've played Genshin or not, I'm sure you're well aware of the complaints about the lack of in-game. It's one of the things Genshin, the game, not the fandom, is notorious for. Now, coming from Genshin and D3, I was flabbergasted to see this complaint rear its ugly head in D4. What? No endgame? It's Diablo. It's almost exclusively endgame. The story is great, but let's be honest, it mostly exists as a gateway to the endgame. When the 40 minutes of credits finally end, it might as well say, "Welcome to Diablo 4. The idea that there are people sitting down, playing this game, beating the campaign, and then being like, "There's no endgame," is incomprehensible to me. Helltides, Trio Whisper, Nightmare Dungeons, World Bosses, PvP, Uber Lilith, the Paragon system, countless build configurations with new builds being theory crafted every day, and the constant grind for gear and gold isn't in-game? That's not even to mention that Season 1 hasn't even started yet. But I have a pretty unique perspective on this as a Genshin player that actually engages in the endgame of Genshin. If you're not a Genshin player and clicked on this video, firstly, welcome, glad to have you. Secondly, what you might not be aware of is that most people that complain about Genshin's apparent lack of endgame don't actually engage in the endgame. What they're saying is, this isn't what I want out of an endgame. And let's be honest, that's totally fair. If you don't enjoy it, you have every right to say so. And I'm not here to try to invalidate your feelings. However, you gotta admit, it's a little disingenuous to claim there's no endgame if you don't even engage in it. Not, I tried it and it felt like my level 80 characters were doing no damage to level 100 plus enemies despite absolutely murking the level 70 to 90 enemies in Overworld, so I refuse to do it again. Engaging in the endgame means to actually look at it as a problem that needs to be solved using the tools the game makes available to you. It's totally fine and completely understandable if you don't like the endgame. It's got its problems. It's totally fine and understandable to say it's bad, but to pretend it doesn't exist at all is kind of wild. I suspect that's what's also happening in Diablo 4. The players are muddling their way through the campaign without learning how the game works, but think they've got a handle on it because they're succeeding in some fairly challenging content. Then they get to the end game and their melting pot of a build just isn't enough to cut it anymore. They stop having fun and claim there's no end game. I know that seems harsh, but when we look at some of the other popular complaints, it starts to become pretty obvious that this might actually be the case. A little bit of Genshin history for you. When the game first came out, it took a while before people started to get a handle on how elemental reactions worked. Certain extremely large content creators even went as far as to say elemental mastery was a useless stat. And we're still trying to recover from the impact of that to this very day. That's why when I started playing Diablo 4 and I saw certain very large content creators saying vulnerable is useless, and then hearing multiple people in the same clan as me, whom I know watch this content creator, say the same thing, it was CJ from San Andreas on repeat in my brain. You see, you might be surprised to hear this, but damage in Genshin and in Diablo is calculated pretty similarly. In Genshin, you've got your talent multiplier times your base stat times your damage bonus times crit times your reaction multiplier. In Diablo, you have your ability multiplier times your base stat times your damage bonus times your X% multiplier times crit times vulnerable. Genshin's is a bit more complicated because we also have to multiply enemy resistances and enemy defense for our damage, and in a strange turn of events, those actually end up working the same way in Diablo 4, but for damage to your character. But the idea is the same. Ability times base times damage times crit times special game mechanic. In Diablo's case, there's an entire extra multiplier which allows you to get some wacky numbers pretty easily. But you've got to invest in all of them if you want those wacky numbers. Same as Genshin. Another similarity that my Genshin audience might be surprised to hear about are damage buckets. In Diablo, you see this with damage with, damage to, damage while, damage from, etc. These are all modifiers to your damage percent multiplier. When the condition is met, those bonuses are added to that multiplier or bucket. Damage percent in Diablo isn't the only bucket that has multiple sources added to it, but it is the primary bucket that stacks various sources into a single multiplier. And the same can be said in Genshin. For an example, let's take a look at Kirara. This isn't an ideal build for her, but it will help demonstrate the interaction. She currently has a Dendro Goblet that gives 46% Dendro damage. She also has this umbrella that gives 32% damage to enemies it marks. And she has Emblem of Severed Fate that is currently giving her 38.9% burst damage. All of these forms of damage percent are added together into the same damage bucket. And then that bucket is multiplied with her talent, attack, and crit. Even the idea of vulnerable is basically the same concept behind an amplifying reaction in Genshin. In Genshin, if there is a certain element on the enemy and you apply damage from a certain other element, you get the reaction multiplier. In Diablo, if there's vulnerable on the enemy and you apply damage, you get the vulnerable multiplier. You see, even if you aren't triggering an amplifying reaction in Genshin, or vulnerable in Diablo, those factors are still part of the damage calculation. They're just represented by 1. When you multiply something by 1, it stays the same. Not using it simply means not taking advantage of something that can improve your damage. The devs put it in there for a purpose. Use it. I've done this before in my Sans video, but let's take a minute to look at a really simple way of understanding this that will help in both Diablo 4 and in Genshin. In both games, there is a stat ceiling. There is a max number of possible stats for you to allocate in different places. It's a limited pool of stats. So, in the most basic sense, because that stat pool is limited, investing into one stat means not investing into another stat. Knowing that, let's look at an example. We're multiplying 4 numbers together. We also have 4 points to add to any of those numbers. Until we invest those points, the base number is 1. So at first we have 1 times 1 times 1 times 1 equals 1. What happens if we put all of those points into the first number? Well, it becomes 5 times 1 times 1 times 1 equals 5. There's a lot bigger than 1, but it's not the highest number we can get here. Also, if we dump all those points into a different stat instead, we still get 5 because everything else is being multiplied by 1. What if we put 2 points into different numbers? Then we have 3 times 3 times 1 times 1 equals 9. Hey, splitting them up almost doubled our result, but we can still do better. For our highest possible answer, after all our investment, we want all of these numbers being multiplied together to be as close as possible. So let's put one of our points into each stat. 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 equals 16. Back to Diablo and Genshin, it's funny to see this misunderstanding of how multiplication works play out the same way in both games. In both games, the misconception that got thrown around early on was that crit was the only important stat. But from a fundamental understanding of multiplication, we know that if there are 4 multipliers and you ignore 3 of them, your result will be far lower than if you had diversified equally. There's a reason why when something is increasing as large as it possibly can, we call it exponential growth. The difficulty scaling in both games is designed with that in mind. Put simply, adding extra multipliers increases your damage exponentially in the truest sense. That's what it means for something to be exponential. Speaking of difficulty scaling, this is really funny because it's almost 1-to-1 with the two games. In Genshin, it's through negative multipliers to your damage to enemies from enemy resistance and defense, and in Diablo, it's through negative multipliers to the damage you take from enemies through resistance, armor, and damage reduction. What's more, they work in the same way. In Genshin, if an enemy has 50% resistance, your damage is essentially cut in half. So it's really important to work things that lower enemy resistance into your teams. In Diablo, if you have 50% resist all, the damage you take is essentially cut in half. So it's really important to work resistances into your builds. Currently, resistances in Diablo are a bit bugged, and the concept is kind of a wash in the first place because for it to be effective, you'd want to stack one kind of resistance. But if you do that, you don't have resistance to everything else. So you either diversify and your resistances don't cut it against anything, or you stack into one resistance and get murked by everything else. It'd probably be better if there weren't so many types of resistances. Like I mentioned before, we've got a limited stat pool. We just don't have enough to stack every resistance to an adequate level while still having enough damage to actually kill enemies. Especially when some enemies have friggin' vampiric. You also have straight damage reduction in both games. It's pretty nice, works exactly how you'd think. Way undervalued in Genshin in my opinion, but an absolute must in Diablo since resistances aren't working as intended at the moment. In Genshin, enemy defense scales with your level compared to the enemy. If you exceed the enemy's level, you do more damage. If you're lower level, you do less damage. The further away from the level you get, the bigger the impact. The closer you are to the level, the less you notice the impact. Side note, that's one of the reasons why Spiral Abyss, Genshin's endgame, feels so bad to so many players. It's basically world level 9. Not only have the monsters increased in HP with their levels, like you'd expect in any game, but the level disparity when you're going at it with level 70 or 80 characters means you're having to take out that extra HP while doing less damage. It feels bad. That's why when I saw a short saying, we need world level 9 and Spiral Abyss 13 with level 110 plus enemies, and that same person saying not to level 90 characters in another short, I died a little inside. We'd have to increase the character level cap, and most players are already refusing to max level most of their characters. The intention would be lost among the player base. Anyway, it's actually the same in Diablo, but for damage you take. If you took enemies with the same exact stats, but different levels, enemies that are a higher level than you would do more damage to you, and enemies that are a lower level than you would do less damage to you. Since levels are a lot harder to come by in Diablo, at least for the time being, you stack armor to make up for that disparity to push higher level content. However, in both games, the scaling isn't linear, it's logarithmic. The further you are from having the same level, the bigger and more noticeable the disparity becomes. All things considered, I think that the contrast of where defensive stats are calculated in the two games makes a lot of sense. Genshin players might wish they had the Diablo system, so they have more of an excuse to focus on defensive units and gear. And Diablo players might wish they had Genshin systems, so they didn't have to focus so much on it. But it comes down to the types of endgame. Diablo's endgame is just more hardcore. It's more about survival. You're actually punished by dying by having to do repair cost, or by having to completely start over in hardcore. And there's no penalty for taking too long. A DPS loss is acceptable because your DPS is 0 if you're dead. In Genshin, you've got about 90 seconds to clear a chamber, so you're encouraged to focus more on offensive stats. You want to make it tougher to meet that threshold? Buff the defensive stats of the enemies. You want to make it tougher to clear content in Diablo? You buff the enemy's damage. I understand not liking the way either of those things feels as a player, but it fits the nature of the content. Back to levels for a minute, leveling characters in both games sucks. However, in Genshin, it's because the game is intentionally designed that way to encourage you to spend resin on ley lines to get experience books. In practice, it's actually impossible to level a character from mob experience alone, to the point where mob experience is actually kind of a pointless mechanic. In practice, it takes a little over a week to max level a character with XP books from ley lines alone, but keep in mind ley lines aren't the only way to get XP books, so on average it'll probably be a little less than a week if you keep up with all the other ways the game rewards us with them. That's right, Diablo 4 players. Genshin players say maxing out a character's level is too much work when it only takes about a week, and the primary thing to do it takes about 8 minutes a day. Though, Genshin players also have to get other specific mats from bosses to continue leveling at certain thresholds that also take resin, which can effectively double the time it takes. But they also more than likely already farmed those materials when they heard the character's banner was approaching. I will say, as a Genshin player, seeing how bad the XP scaling is in Diablo makes me worried it's for the same reasons as Genshin. If it turns out the Battle Pass XP boosts are comparable to XP books in Genshin, Blizzard will be drifting across the line into pay-to-win territory. As it stands right now, it is decidedly not. I'll touch on that later, but the fear is in the back of my mind because as a Genshin player, I can see it being used that way. Now that we have some fundamentals of the game's mechanics out of the way, let's get back to something I alluded to earlier: build variety and the meta. Another common complaint in Diablo 4 is that there isn't any build variety. To that I say, chill bro, the game's new. We're still figuring this stuff out. As I alluded to earlier, new builds are coming out every day. Builds are even being fine-tuned specifically for different parts of the end game. Your Uber Lilith build will not be the same build you use to grind nightmares. Considering the game design is geared toward having multiple builds for a single character, I think it's pretty ignorant to claim every class only has one build. But at the same time, there's math in this game. There's going to be a theoretical best and worst way to go about building a character. No matter how balanced everything is, as long as our numbers exceed 1, there's going to be a standout build. And people are going to chase it because it's fun to feel like a badass. Likewise, there will be people that will dissect that standout build and see what they can come up with that's comparable. Why is that a bad thing? If you want to build a Sork of one element but aren't doing any damage because you can't get any vulnerable or X% multipliers, how is that a problem with the game? If you stack all damaging affixes and have no resistances or armor and die because an enemy breathed on you, how is that a problem with the game? If you build a bunch of abilities that use resource, but don't take advantage of the dozens of ways you can work resource generation into your build and can never use those abilities, how is that a problem with the game? The game's giving you the tools to get those things, and you're choosing not to use them. This isn't a sandbox game. It's got rules and mechanics. You'll have a better time if you learn them. Let me just give you an example of how important following the rules is in games. Think about your favorite sport, your favorite team. They're the best team, right? No one compares. There's no way your team could lose. But how many times has your team lost because one idiot player who you've said for years the coach needs to just bench keeps getting penalties? You watch that player and you're like, who taught them to play? Do they even know the rules? If they would just shut up and follow the rules like a grown-ass man, my team would assuredly be undefeated. The fans would love it, and he'd be happier because he'd be winning. Basically, what I'm saying is, don't be DJ Moore. It's not the NFL's fault your Incinerate Sork is out of mana and getting bopped by corpse bows. It's the same in Genshin. It's not the game's fault if you listen to some guy on the internet that said, just give them the pieces with the most crit subs, and your triple death character isn't doing any damage. It's not the game's fault you didn't read the tooltips about elemental reactions and don't know what an aura is. The game is designed so that every character has an optimal way to play them and build them. It's your business if you want to give Ito a Dendro Goblet, but the only person you should be mad at when it doesn't work is yourself. The game sure as hell didn't tell you to do it. Now, let's circle back to something I kind of glossed over. Meta. This isn't just a Diablo or Genshin thing. Practically every game has a meta, and every game has players that shout, "Meta slave," at anyone that follows a build or cares about learning the rules of the game. Here's the thing. I don't think y'all know what meta is. Meta is the most effective tactic available. It is not, that person used brain. They meta slave. Right now, even after nerfs, Whirlwind Varb is the Diablo meta, and Blood Mist Necro for solo is on its way. That's pretty much it. Does that mean those are the only good builds? No, not by a long shot. It means those are the best builds at this point in time. Everything else, for the moment, is off meta. Does that mean they're bad? No. A lot of builds are pretty damn close to the meta, but they are not the most effective builds by an ever so slight margin. And let me tell you something, if you look at the meta, it can serve as inspiration for the off-meta builds of your dreams. Why? Because the meta isn't some unknowable prophecy sent by the gods. It's tested by theory crafters that offer explanations for how and why certain interactions work. Having trouble with resource generation, survivability, damage? Check out the meta build. See how they're handling those issues, and see if you can work any of that into your build. Use it to troubleshoot the problems you're having with your characters. It's just another tool for your kit. No one's saying you have to follow it exactly, and all other builds be damned. I'll be the first to admit that's not fun. Like I mentioned earlier, feeling like a badass is fun, yes, but feeling like a badass with a build you came up with yourself is funner. That's the real purpose of the meta. It gives you the tools you need to actually optimize your wacky ideas and make them work instead of banging your head against the wall screaming, "This thing I want, this other thing to do, doesn't automatically do the thing I want it to do, therefore game is shit, poo-poo out of 10. And in a new game that's as deep as Diablo, I don't expect to immediately be able to figure things out on my own. Hell, I don't expect the theory crafters to have everything right day one. Last I checked, we're still a bit conflicted about overpower, but I tell you what, I'll definitely figure it out faster and make less mistakes if I take the time to learn from someone else that's done it already. That said, let me address something more Genshin related real quick. Waifu over meta. You love your waifu. You want what's best for your waifu. You don't want to force your waifu to do things she doesn't want to do, right? If you do, that's not love. Let me tell you a secret. Your waifu wants you to enjoy the game. All of the game, including the Spiral Abyss. And she doesn't want to die. The Spiral Abyss gives you an extra 11.25 pulls per patch. You only get 15.75 from daily commissions per patch. That's a 71.43% increase to your primos every patch if all you do is commissions. You can use those pulls to get more friends and gear for your waifu. Meta isn't your waifu's enemy, it's her friend. It makes you happy to see your waifu do well. It makes her happy to not die. The meta is there to help with those things. The meta is your wingman. Your waifu will thank you. Now, I'm not here to be a Hoyo and Blizzard apologist. There's definitely some issues with these games, and I've played a lot of both. So let's do some comparison and contrast. First off, watch what happens when I leave town in Genshin. Now, watch what happens when I leave a town in Diablo 4. If this were any other game, we'd be saying the game is a buggy mess. I'm gonna be straight with you. This is why I haven't streamed Diablo. I love the game, but this is unacceptable. And I can't help but feel like we wouldn't have this issue if Blizzard didn't try so hard to bring in WoW players. The MMO stuff is a fine idea, but in practice, what is it actually good for? PvP and world bosses to an extent. Wouldn't it be more efficient to just have client-side worlds and server-based instances for PvP and world bosses that you can just queue for? I know this is a really unpopular opinion, but come on, look at this. Is it really worth this? Especially when you can only have 4 people in a group anyway? Mounts. Bruh, mounts in Diablo suck. I'm not going to nitpick about the mouse being close to the character. Maybe it's because I play range classes and I'm used to having to point where I want things to be, but I figured that out intuitively. I don't get why it bothers people so much. However, enemies putting up walls sucks. The cooldown when they put up a wall and knock you off your horse sucks. Having to dismount to get rid of the wall sucks. A lot of times it can be tough to tell what land is even traversable and you end up bumping into walls, but until they fix mounts, it is nice that most builds have ways to move faster than them at in-game on foot anyway. But when they fix mounts, that will suck. Horses should move faster than people. Knowing Blizzard, they'll probably nerf move speed instead of buffing mount speed, and that will suck. We don't really have mounts in Genshin except for the boat, which sucks, but we do have Bubbles, a Yukiona, Sonic, If the Flash and Oliver Queen Had a Baby, MXR's Fallout intro, and Boxcat. They've gotten better over time. It's still not perfect, but Wonder and Kirara are actually pretty incredible for getting around. Waypoints. Diablo has too few waypoints. Make at least some of the dungeons waypoints, please. Genshin has too many waypoints. Sometimes it's like you're gambling about which location you're going to. Am I going to be on a mountain, on the ground, below ground? It's anybody's guess. Make the main city's waypoints always visible. Genshin does this with its statues of 7. Diablo 4 even does this when you make a new character after clearing the campaign. Just make it always do that. Also, Diablo 4 players, look at this Genshin map. Pretty big, right? It must be a big pain to have to scroll from Inazuma to Mondstadt. Let me show you something really cool. Eh? You like what you see? Blizzard, do this. Another common ask is for statues of Lowell to have some kind of indicator when you're close. Oh, do you mean like the oculi in Genshin do? Oh, and like town portals in Diablo 4 already do. Yeah, that'd be cool. Another common complaint is stash space. Allow me to show you how much artifact space we have in Genshin. Bam! And look at this, a separate tab for weapons with even more space, even though you need less weapons than artifacts. Too little weapon space means whales have to stop pulling to clear their inventory, and that may make them not spend money. Oh, and D4 players, get this. Genshin players complain about not having enough storage space too. Real quick, neat little trick. There's 5 character classes, right? Well, if you've got a character in each class, you've got 5 more character slots. Since they share the stash, you could use those character slots as mules and get yourself 165 extra gear slots. Though that might be an issue when Season 1 drops. Reroll cost. Look at this. This is insane. It'd be more efficient to farm for a new weapon at this point. If it's more efficient to replace the item and all the resources you put into it are wasted as a result, what's even the point of having rerolls? However, at least they're there. Genshin is the only one of Hoyo's big 3 that doesn't have a reroll mechanic for gear. They've shown they can do it. They just won't. At least our main stats aren't also RNG. Search functions. In conjunction with that, I see the comment, it's because it was designed for console. Bruh, look at this. Search functions. This game was designed for friggin' mobile and adapted for console and PC by a company whose revenue was $26 million in 2019 before Genshin launched. In comparison, Blizzard's was over $6 billion that year. Yeah, no excuse. It's got nothing to do with console or capabilities. Get on that. Also, real quick, I appreciate a lot of stuff from the fireside chat the other day. That said, with the question of it was in Diablo 3, why isn't it in Diablo 4, was answered with it's coming. That doesn't answer the question, man. It is the plan to keep people in Diablo 4 playing in the hope that it will eventually have the features that eventually made D3 good. I'm excited for D4 to be as comfortable to play as D3. Why don't you just play D3 then? D3 is as comfortable to play as D3 right now. Bugs. Let me tell you, I have never seen anybody in Genshin accidentally plunge attack through the world. I don't think there's a single barb that's put leap on their action bar and hasn't fallen through the map. Reminder, multi-billion-dollar company. Renown. I'm on the fence here. I'll be honest, I don't want to do side quests again to get my renown up. But the devs seem to really want that renown to be part of the gameplay loop. If that's their vision for the game, what are you going to do? It's their game. That said, maybe when Season 1 drops, make it to where Tree of Whispers mission give you renown too. I know they said you'd still have 1,000 renown if you did everything, but that last 1,000 renown is the worst anyway, right? As I mentioned before, my ideal gameplay loop doesn't send me off doing something that hurts my progress toward my goals. At least if you make the Tree of Whispers give renown, I'm still getting affixes toward my build and nightmare sigils. Lastly, pay to win. Diablo 4 ain't pay to win. Who y'all talking to? Look at this shop. What about this is pay to win? There ain't stats on any of this. Are you winning, son? I bought the Wraith Lord skin. You could have just said no, smartass. Genshin, yeah, it's a bit pay to win, but I feel like that's kind of a misnomer. It's less pay to win and more pay to not play. Check out any whale content creator. Their quest logs are full, their map is undiscovered, they have 1000 out of 160 resin. If you actually sit down and play the game like it's a video game instead of a slot machine, you get enough primos to get characters. If you don't use your resin exclusively on artifact domains, you've got enough materials to invest in your characters. Also, let me tell you, when I stopped whaling, I actually got more characters and weapons. When you've got that whale mindset, you set an amount to spend and pray to the RNG gods that they come home. When you sit down and play the game like it's an actual video game, like the Breath of the Wild clone with more in-depth and engaging combat, characters, and lore that it is, you get a lot of primos and mats. If you were a whale and went free-to-play or welcome battle pass, or vice versa, let me know in the comments. When did you most enjoy Genshin? When you dropped hundos on characters, or when you played through the game and got the primos for your characters just by engaging in the content the game provides for free? So, what's my takeaway here? A lot of problems people tend to have with the game don't really hold up to scrutiny, and it's really surprising that players aren't more upset about the connection issues and bugs. Issues that the same players moaning about vulnerable damage would probably look at another game with the same issues and say it's unplayable. It needs work. My rating? 10 out of 10, game of the year, almost as good as Genshin, would run into bone walls with my horse again.